We now come to amendment number 3, with which it would be convenient also to discuss amendment 4, clause 4 stand part, and 5 and 6, amendments 5 and 6, and clause 5 stand part. Neil Brown.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Clauses 4 and 5 of the bill, to which our amendments apply, allow the Secretary of State to prepare, respectively, either a standard or an apprenticeship assessment plan on her own. And she can do that as long as she is satisfied that it would be more appropriate for the standards to be prepared by the Secretary of State rather than a group of persons. The government says that a group of persons will normally be consulted, but the bill does not specify who will be consulted in reference to a group of persons. And that lack of detail is quite concerning, and our amendments to clauses 4 and 5 seek to rectify that. In their written evidence to this committee, the Royal Society of Chemistry say, "We feel some of the mechanisms put in place by IFATE should be retained. The concept of engaging with employers and other stakeholders in relationship to development of apprenticeship standards and technical qualifications is well-founded and valuable." And one of the central pillars of IFATE was its focus on employer and business needs to create and maintain suitable qualifications to equip people for the world of work. And as such, we want to recognise the importance of keeping that focus to ensure that businesses can still trust the qualifications so that they continue to invest in a future generation of employees. And the bill gives very wide-ranging powers to the Secretary of State without maintaining those clear external links and the accountability that they help to provide. And that's potentially damaging to the status of these qualifications. So our Amendment 3 states that a group of persons under subsection 3 must include a representative from an organisation that's a representative body for a sector, and Amendment 4 says that when approving a standard under subsection 3, the Secretary of State must have regard to the reasonable requirements of industry, commerce, finance, professions and other employers regarding education and training, and persons who may wish to undertake education and training. And our amendments 5 and 6 I won't read out because they just repeat the same things in relation to clause 5. You would think that these are pretty uncontentious, and I hope that the government will be able to accept them. It's not obvious at all to me why they would be any problem to anybody. In the Lords, ministers did seem to be resistant of these ideas, and in the Lords, minister argued that this would be a constraint in the system and would, she talked about slowing down groups coming together. But it's not at all obvious to me why this would slow things down. The power to make standards and assessment plans alone is not something that we would ever accept for academic side qualifications. You would not have the Secretary of State being allowed to write the national curriculum for, let's say, GCSE geography, and then to take on the role of the examining boards, to take on the role with OCR or Cambridge Assessment or whatever, and to turn that into a specification. And you would not then accept it if she took on the role of off-qual and was in charge of marking her own homework and deciding whether the standards were comparable to other similar things. And yet, here, under this bill, that is exactly what we will be able to do on the technical side. And as my honourable friend from East Hampshire pointed out earlier on, this is another difference in the old thing about parity of esteem between the technical and the academic side. So the Secretary of State will be able to be judge, jury and executioner in this piece of legislation. When it asked for an example of when this power to just go it alone and just write things herself will actually be used, the Skills Minister told peers that it could be used to, and I quote, "update standards for emerging or rapidly developing occupations, such as those in the digital sector." Now, personally, I don't find that very reassuring. Having seen governments and civil servants struggling with implications of new technologies, I think actually that it might be an example where there was more cause to work with others who know the industry well, rather than go it alone. So I'm not sure that's the example I would pick of why this is a good idea. And the crossbench peer, Baroness Wolfe, noted that, and she says, "I was staggered when I was working as an expert advisor in government to discover, for example, that most people in the apprenticeship division of the DFE had only been in their jobs for a couple of years. There were some wonderful people, but there was no real collective memory of why things had gone wrong before. That is why you have to make it clear in the legislation that, as Skills England goes forward, and as particularly in this context, its apprenticeship functions go forward, it has to involve everybody, even though it takes longer." And all of this matters because the framework document, which has now been published, which I have here, is at best vague and at worst silent on the involvement of employers. There are some vague statements about, in the section on aims, employers will be engaged in the preparation of standards and so on, but it doesn't say how. And the rest of the document, particularly the section on the responsibilities of the CEO, CEOs as it were, doesn't refer to this, focusing just on their role as the AO, in relation to the board, in relation to their responsibilities to the DFE. There's no mention of employers. There's no explicit reference in the section on the purposes of the new agency, just the reference that I mentioned earlier on. And so if I was an employer, I might be concerned by this. We have this strange proposal that the Secretary of State will just be allowed to write everything herself whenever she believes that is advantageous. And all we are trying to do with our amendments here, we're not even trying to stop that, though we are very, very sceptical about it. We are just trying to say when people are involved in it, the sorts of people who will be involved. Really, it's our way of trying to encourage the government to be much, much, much clearer than it has been so far in the framework document or anywhere else about how it's going to maintain that focus, which IFET had and was really the purpose of IFET, on the involvement of employers in the drawing up of these things, rather than a situation where politicians, maybe not current ministers, maybe future ministers, go off with some foible of their own or got some particular idea or bee in their bonnet and potentially impose what they want without really listening to industry. That is our concern. That's why we've brought forward these amendments. Perhaps the Minister will say some things to reassure us on this point, and perhaps she'll even accept the amendments.
Amendment proposed, clause 4, page 2, line 6. At the end, insert the words on the amendment paper. The question is the amendment being made. Ian Sullivan.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve on you this afternoon. And I'd like to express Lib Dem support for the amendments put forward by the Honourable Member for Harborough, Oakley and Wigston. These amendments actually address a real critical weakness of the bill, and that's the lack of any concrete requirement for the Secretary of State to meaningfully engage with employers or industry bodies when preparing standards or apprenticeship assessment plans. Now, while far from perfect, one strength of the current system does lie in its connection to industry needs, and employers understand better than anyone else the skills required for their sectors, and their involvement is essential for maintaining the credibility and relevance of standards and assessment plans. Without those safeguards, there is a risk over time that the standards and assessment plans could become disconnected from workplace realities, and that would undermine the value of apprenticeships and technical qualifications for both employers and learners. So I think it really shouldn't be a problem with ensuring that link is maintained, and that's why we support these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christopher. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of the centrality of employer involvement in setting standards for technical and vocational qualifications. I mentioned earlier the background of the Sainsbury report and its findings that the system had become divorced. That was the word used, divorced from the occupations that the then qualifications, the then courses were meant to serve. And if we talk about T-levels, there's a number of things that are different about T-levels compared to the predecessor qualifications. There's more time in college, there's English and maths and digital alongside the core vocational discipline. But when you talk to young people doing T-levels, there's two things that they talk about as being the real kind of differentiating, distinguishing factor and that motivated them to do the T-level. The first is about the industrial placement, 9 weeks of actual work in an actual workplace, which also, of course, appeals very strongly to employers because, as well as everything else, it's like a 9-week job interview. It's a fantastic way to see people coming through. You're investing in the next generation, but you're also getting to figure out which of the next generation you most want in your business. And it's a way for employers to instill those so-called soft skills. There's nothing soft about soft skills, but it's those sometimes called employability skills. Actually, the thing that employers complain about most when they talk about the education system or about people joining, taking their first job, is about not having so much of that development. Of course, that can all be done or be helped during the industrial placement. But the second thing that people talk about as the distinguishing factor for a T-level is the fact that you know that these standards have been designed by the people that I want to go and work for. They've been designed by leading employers in that sector. And of course, they have to also be kept up to date. Now, Clause 4 in the bill says the Secretary of State herself may prepare standards instead of a group of persons. Now, it's worth just dwelling, I'm sure everybody knows this, but group of persons is a funny old phrase. It means employers in this context. But the clause says the Secretary of State may insert herself in the process instead of that group of persons if she is satisfied that would be more appropriate. And ditto in Clause 5 on assessment plans. Now, when this was debated in the other place, there were government amendments made to try, I think, to calm some of the concerns, some of the questions that were raised. And Lord's Amendments 3 and 6, which I repeat are government amendments, appear here as lines 15 to 19 on page 2 and lines 5 to 10 on page 3. They say that ministers will publish something about the things that the Secretary of State takes into account in making the judgment of whether it will be her rather than a group of persons, rather than employers, who will set those standards. And the suggestion that we've had from ministers, I'm not doubting this by the way, I'm just saying at the moment it's only a suggestion, we don't know, but the suggestion is that this will be a very minimalist interpretation. In other words, the Secretary of State would only supplant the actual businesses, the employers, if there was something like something minor, like a minor, maybe an important thing, but minor in its effect on the standard, like a change in the regulation. But I'm still left a bit nonplussed why that would mean you wouldn't still want employers to be involved in working out how, even a change in regulation, what that means in terms of what somebody doing this qualification will learn how to go about it. So can the Minister tell us what reason there could be for not wanting employers to be involved in setting those standards? And does she have a mountain of evidence, perhaps, of hold-ups in standards because of all these new regulatory changes that have had to be reflected in standards for qualifications and it's been impossible to do so? It's also suggested, as my honourable friend the Shadow Minister said, that this could be relevant in the case of rapidly developing occupations. It might be necessary for the Secretary of State to sign those off so changes can happen quickly. I'd suggest, Sir Christopher, some of these, the most rapidly changing occupations and sectors are probably the last thing you would want to say, well, let's take the employers out of the equation and let government make those changes. If we talk about things like advanced electronics or artificial intelligence, and actually it's generally speaking employers who are much quicker to spot the changes that are needed and pushing for those things to happen. Now, Amendments 3 and 5, in the name of my honourable friend, specify that the group of persons should include an organisation that is a representative body for a sector. That seems to me a very, very sensible and essentially almost unarguable proposition. While the Amendments 4 and 6, in his name, require the body to take account of the needs and interests of both employer and employee. Now, Sir Christopher, I was trying to imagine, were we having this debate in a committee room of the Bundestag, would we really have a debate about whether it should be part of the remit for a body of persons to consider the needs both of employer and employee and to include leading employers from those sectors in the design of the qualifications? I suggest to you not.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I rise to speak to Group 2, which includes Amendments 3, 4, 5 and 6, as well as clauses 4 and 5. Members of the committee, through this bill, we are making a small number of targeted improvements that enable flexibility and support employers to engage in the design of standards in an appropriate way by focusing their time and effort where it is most needed. Clause 4 amends the requirement for occupational standards to be prepared by a group of persons by making it subject to a power for the Secretary of State to create and update standards in circumstances where it is appropriate to do so, while Clause 5 does the same in regard to the preparation of apprenticeship assessment plans. I can assure members that the default position will remain that in the majority of cases, groups of persons will prepare standards and apprenticeship assessment plans. Only when the Secretary of State is satisfied that it is more appropriate for them to prepare a standard or assessment plan than for a group of persons will the Secretary of State then do so. To ensure transparency, the Secretary of State will publish information about matters they will take into account when making the decision to prepare a standard or assessment plan without a group of persons. Scenarios...
Give me hands.
Why don't they just do that now? I mean, how hard is it to figure out this list of the criteria that might weigh on the mind of the Secretary of State? Why do we have to have a statement about a statement in the future? Why can't the government say now what those criteria would be before this bill completes its passage through the House of Commons?
Minister.
So, I mean, as I progress, I'm sure the honourable member will understand more why we're going in this travel of direction. But my understanding is that this is a response from an amendment from the Lords, and when the Secretary of State is making sure she's as transparent and as open as possible during this process. And as I continue to speak, you'll understand why, what he's... Or may or may not. But I will endeavour to explain why a statement now is not the most appropriate thing. Scenarios in which it is likely to be appropriate for the Secretary of State to use the power to prepare a standard or assessment plan, or those where using a group would be disproportionately onerous unnecessarily because only simple corrections are required or where it could create undue delays. With regards to standards, this might include creating or updating standards to align with industry recognised qualifications or statutory requirements. For example, the dental...
You also talked about using this power where there is, quote, undue delay. What is an undue delay? What would be too long, roughly?
Minister.
One of the reasons that we have this bill is because we recognise the skill set is changing very quickly, and we need to keep up with that within England. And therefore, we need to make sure there is not delay, so that we have enough, so people have the skills to be able to get into the jobs that are required. We have a skill shortage, and we need to make sure that we're responding. This bill enables us to be able to respond. We do not want delays, so therefore then the standards can be set, things can be done in a manner which enables people to be able to undertake the training that they need. Now, I was about to move on to scenarios.
Just to press this point a little bit, so Minister's worried about undue delays, but what sort of time frame is it undue delays? You worried that something will be held up by a week? Or by a month, or what is it? What's an undue delay?
If the Shadow Minister will bear with me, because I will be presenting a scenario and an example where actually I'm hoping he will recognise that there could possibly be some delays with some niche situations. Scenarios in which it is likely to be appropriate for the Secretary of State to use the power to prepare a standard or assessment plan are those where using a group would be disproportionately onerous unnecessary because only simple corrections are required or where it could create undue delays, as I've already said. With regards to standards, this might include creating or updating standards to align with industry recognised qualifications or statutory requirements. For example, the dental hygienist occupation is regulated by the General Dental Council. This means competence is tightly defined and does not need to be separately considered by a group of persons approved by IFATE. However, the current legislations mean that a group of persons must be in place to prepare the standard, despite it being unnecessary and a duplicated practice process. With regards to assessment plans, the nuclear industry provides an example of where there is a strong support for apprenticeships that limited capacity to engage in the development of multiple training products simultaneously. As I've outlined, clauses 4 and 5 make crucial changes to bring flexibility to support employers and other experts to engage in the design of apprenticeships and technical education in a proportionate way by focusing their time and effort where it is most needed. I therefore ask the committee that these clauses stand part of the bill. Turning now to Amendments 3 and 5, which would prescribe in legislation a particular type of person to be included as a part of a group of persons to prepare a standard or an assessment plan, these matters were raised several times by peers in the other place. Our position remains clear. Specifying criteria in primary legislation would introduce new and unnecessary constraints on the structure of groups, prioritising the expertise of certain types of organisations above others. It would make the process for groups being formed slower and more onerous, slowing the speed with which important skills gaps are plugged. Delays are not in anyone's interest, not least learners or indeed employers. The existing legislation does not include criteria for how a group is formed to prepare a standard or an assessment plan, or who specifically should form part of a group. Different expert voices have a role to play, indeed, in different circumstances. IFATE is under an existing duty to publish information about matters it will consider when deciding whether to approve groups or persons responsible for preparing a standard or an assessment plan, which in effect shapes how a group is convened and which types of organisations most commonly participate. This ensures that groups are inclusive and independent, and this existing duty is being transferred to the Secretary of State unchanged. Flexibility is essential to ensure that a group of persons always reflects the particular circumstances requiring it to be formed. Now turning to Amendments 4 and 6, which would create a statutory duty on the Secretary of State to have due regard to the reasonable requirements of industry and those who may wish to undertake training when considering whether to approve a standard or assessment plan where they have been developed by a group of persons. The Secretary of State is already subject to a general public law duty, which requires them to take into account all the relevant considerations before taking decisions related to the functions for which they are responsible. There is therefore already a requirement that when executing the functions described in this bill, the Secretary of State considers and balances the needs of different users of the system, such as those outlined in this amendment. In fact, the public law duty is broader than the factors listed in the proposed amendments and includes consideration of value for money and quality. I can assure members that I can assure members that the consultative approach taken by IFATE by developing standards will not change as a result of the bill transferring functions to the Secretary of State. New standards and those that have undergone material revisions will continue to be published online for comment by any interested parties before approval, and existing duties to publish information about matters that will be considered when approving groups and standards will transfer from IFATE to the Secretary of State unamended. Amendments 4 and 6 are therefore duplicative of existing duties on the Secretary of State that will be fulfilled by Skills England. For the reasons I've given, I ask the Honourable Member withdraws their amendments.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. There are arguments that I can hear in what the Minister says about some of these things. I can hear that there is a case for where there are only the most minor technical changes to things. There is a case for not having to have a group of people. I haven't heard anywhere, though, in the Minister's comments or in the other place, any sense that there is some great delay or problem introduced by talking to people in industry. That shred of evidence has never been produced during this process. But it's clear that the Minister's intent is not just that. It's not just a situation where there are minor and technical changes. And it's not just a situation where there is a very clear third-party body, like in the dentistry example. We hear these other examples. We hear the tech sector. Oh, we want to be able to do things really quickly. Well, I can see the attraction politically of that dynamic young minister wanting to come up with some new whizzy thing. And that is exactly where problems come in. And then we also had this example like the nuclear industry. Well, the industry is not able to participate in drawing up the standards for itself, therefore we'll just crack on with it without them. That's a curious argument and not a reassuring one, particularly in something as serious as the nuclear industry. So I am keen, Mr Chairman, that we put our Amendment 4 to the vote today. I hope that the ministers will reflect further on this point about the whole run of what the government has been doing on apprenticeships, combined with what's happening with IFA, is raising a lot of concerns.
Minister give way? Sorry, the opposition minister.
Very happy to give way.
Minister.
I just felt it might be helpful for the honourable member to know that where an occupation is regulated, the requirements for assessing competence are tightly defined and cannot be deviated from. For example, the paramedic apprenticeship where the occupation is regulated by the Health and Care Professions Council. It is not necessary for a group in such circumstances to prepare a standard, and the process for producing an assessment plan would therefore be significantly sped up by not requiring a group of persons to form and undertake the work. The current legislation means that a group of persons would still need to be in place in such instances, which is unnecessary and duplicative in practice.
This is exactly the point I was just making. So there are instances where you can say, look, there is already this formal, official third party, maybe it's a royal society, maybe it's some part of the medical profession, where you don't need this. Fine, I can see why you would write that into legislation, but it's clear that ministers' intent goes beyond minor amendments, and it goes beyond the instances where there is this other group, to instances where they will be proceeding without drawing up a group of people in the interests of time, or in the interests that it's a new and dynamic field. And so it is precisely because they have not defined the circumstances up front that I am keen to put our Amendment 4 to the vote, in order to encourage ministers to think more carefully about how they, perhaps in the framework or perhaps elsewhere, tightly define, as they respond to the Lord's Amendment, tightly define the circumstances in which they will and, more importantly, won't use this ability to do it alone, because there is definitely the risk of politics getting in the way of good process here, and mistakes being made that we'll live to regret.
David Hines.
Thank you very much, Sir Chris. I'd say to the Minister that even for highly regulated occupations and professions, there is still the question of how you transpose that into a set of standards for, say, an apprenticeship. And then the question is, who is the person best placed, or who are the people best placed to work that out? I'm not saying it's not necessarily ministers, but I haven't heard anything sort of slam dunk convincing that it is ministers rather than that professional body. But look, more generally,
Can I just...
of course.
I mean, sometimes you do also have overlapping professional bodies, even in the medical profession. When I was a health minister, I was very acutely aware of that. And for example, two different ways to become a dentist in this country. There are two different professional bodies that can accredit you. And so, for example, if there is a dispute between them, it might well be a sensible thing to convene a group of persons. So, look, I'm sympathetic to at least the argument that where you've got a big professional body, that it's less of a problem. But the problem is it's just not limited to those instances.
It makes unsurprisingly, makes a very good point. Look, I'd also just more generally, in legislation, obviously, one tries to make language as tight as possible, but subtleties in language and meaning do still matter in how legislation gets interpreted. And the way this is written, that the Secretary of State may prepare a standard if satisfied it would be more appropriate, doesn't sound like a tiny number of exceptional cases. It sounds like a judgment that you could make in every case. Do I think it's more appropriate I do it, or do I think it's more appropriate we get somebody else to do it? So I just asked the Minister if they've considered using a different formulation in the wording, something like that each standard must be prepared by a group of persons and then approved by the Secretary of State, unless it is necessary for the efficient operation or continuity of those courses and those qualifications. Sorry, I should have said unless it's necessary to do otherwise for the continuity or good operation of those courses.
Minister, want to come back?
Yeah, I would actually. The default position would be for a group of persons, and that would always be the default position for the Secretary of State. The reason for this would be in terms of making factual corrections, drawing on. Yeah, you've meant. The honourable members have also mentioned this as well. But creating new standards would also be necessary in emerging occupations where there is sufficient high quality evidence that training will be required, but the occupation is not yet at a point of maturity, and where employers are able to invest sufficient time to produce the standard in the first instance, as well as straightforward adjustments in knowledge, skills and behaviours.
Neil Brown.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. This sentence could be written very differently. It could say that where there are only minor or technical amendments to be made, or where you have a clear judgment from a single professional body about what is needed, then the Secretary of State can. But that's not what it says. It just says, if satisfied, would be more appropriate. It's just totally, there's no constraint other than the Secretary of State's own judgment on this, and not even any lists of instances or types of things that it would apply to. And the Minister's just given us another good example of it. It's the Minister says, you might want to do this where there's a new industry. Why on earth would you not want to speak to some people in industry, in an emerging sector, be it biotechnology or tech or whatever it might be? It's just a very strange thing to make as an argument for the open-ended nature of this clause as it's currently drafted. Look, I think we've all made the point the Minister understands the argument that we are making here. They clearly want the power to be more expansive than we think is sensible. I'm keen to put the amendment for that reason, and we'll have to agree to disagree.
Is it the wish of the Honourable Gentleman that he wishes to withdraw Amendment 3 and put Amendment 4 to the vote?
It is.
Is it the wish of the committee that Amendment 3 be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. Amendment proposed, Clause 4, page 2, line 6, at end, insert the words on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Does many people say aye?
Aye.
To the contrary, no?
No.
Division? Lock the doors.
Pam Cox.
No.
Janet Davey.
No.
Josh Dean.
No.
Lauren Edwards.
No.
Vicky Foxcroft.
No.
Anna Gelderd.
No.
Damien Hines.
Aye.
Lee Ingham.
No.
Neil O'Brien.
Aye.
Melanie Ong.
No.
Rebecca Paul.
Aye.
Ian Solomon.
Aye.
Patrick Spencer absent. Alan Strickland.
No.
Peter Swallow.
No.
Lawrence Turner.
Sorry. No.
Thank you. Ayes 4, noes 11, so the noes have it. Unlock. The question is that Clause 4 stand part of the bill. As many opinions say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 5 formally.
Formally.
The question is that Clause 5 stand part of the bill. As many opinions say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that Clause 6 stand part of the bill. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I rise to speak to Group 3, which covers Clause 6 of the bill. Clause 6 amends the requirement to review technical education qualification and standards and apprenticeship assessment plans at regular and published intervals by removing the requirement to publish information about the intervals at which reviews will be conducted. There is no change to the broader review requirement. The Secretary of State will still be required to maintain arrangements to review approved technical education qualification standards and the apprenticeships assessment plans review to determining whether they should be revised, withdrawn or continue to be approved. Removing the requirement to publish information about the intervals at which reviews will be conducted will allow the Secretary of State to determine when reviews of technical education qualifications and standards and apprenticeships assessment plans should be carried out based on need rather than a fixed review point. The clause will allow the Secretary of State to review technical education qualifications and over 700 high-quality occupational standards and apprenticeship assessment plans more frequently where occupations evolve quickly, such as digital. This will ensure technical education qualification standards and apprenticeship assessment plans are kept up to date, coherent and relevant. It will also allow the Secretary of State to take a targeted approach to reviews, tackling issues such as low achievement rates and out-of-date knowledge, behaviours and skills. Without this clause, technical education qualification standards and apprenticeship assessment plans would need to be reviewed at the published intervals rather than based on needs. This would prevent resources being deployed effectively to ensure technical education qualification standards and apprenticeships assessment plans are kept relevant and up to date as required. For example, training providers and assessment organisations have reported difficulties with delivering of the installation, maintenance, electrician and domestic electrician apprenticeships. Both are focused on critical occupations in priority sectors and in delivering the government's home building target. In instances such as these, revision of the standards and assessment plans is likely needed before a fixed review point. This clause means issues can be addressed quickly and support improved delivery of the apprenticeships for the benefit of delivery partners and learners. For the reasons I've set out, I commend this clause to the committee and ask that it stands as part of the bill.
Yeah, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths. This is one of the strangest bits, really, of this bill. It's pretty baffling why the government does not want to review regularly the approval of technical educational qualifications. Without rigorous and independent oversight, there's obviously a risk that the standards of technical qualifications could be lowered or they might not stay as relevant as possible. And in their written evidence to this committee, the Royal Society of Chemistry say, and I quote, "We have concerns about the removal of structured reviews of standards. The very natures of sectors such as science mean the skills evolve very quickly. Not reviewing the necessary skills that apprentices need to carry out roles will be detrimental to the workforce and certainly narrow the opportunities for those apprentices in the long term." And likewise, we also have concerns about this clause, which is deleting, all it's deleting is the requirement that things are updated, quotes, at regular intervals. It's not the most arduous requirement on government of all time. But these regular reviews, they're not just a bureaucratic exercise. They guard against complacency and stagnation. They ensure that technical qualification standards stay fit for purpose, and without them, there's a risk that they become less and less relevant to the needs of both employers and learners. Also sort of sets up a slightly strange sort of conflict because isn't the government basically placing an undue burden on those who are directly involved in the design and delivery of standards to act as their own assessors? And that kind of lack of external scrutiny could lead to a decline of trust among stakeholders, both the learner and the employer. And I just don't understand from what the Minister said why the government doesn't think that this level of scrutiny, the requirements to update things, quotes, at regular intervals. It doesn't say every 2 weeks, it doesn't say every 6 months. It says regularly update things. It's not a wild bureaucratic requirement to keep things up to date. I don't understand really why this is such a thing that must be zapped. The only really golden thread running through DfE legislation at the moment is the sort of maximisation of the power of the officials and the minimisation of any kind of constraints on them, as far as I can see. I just don't understand why this is necessary. I understand that in some areas the review might be very light touch. You might review it and decide you don't need to do anything. But at second reading, the Minister committed to publishing information about the intervals for review. So I wonder if I could ask her, what will they be? What is the plan then? If we're going to get rid of the requirement for regular reviews, how often will they be? What is the process of review going to look like? Independent reviews can provide very valuable feedback to policymakers and training providers alike, which won't necessarily be obvious to ministers who don't follow the ins and outs of an industry every single day. And so Clause 6 as it stands risks eroding the quality of and confidence in technical education qualifications. By removing a statutory requirement for independent review, we risk reducing the rigour that brings, as learned bodies like the Royal Society of Chemistry have pointed out. And I just do not understand what problem ministers are trying to solve here by getting rid of a very simple and basic requirement to review things regularly.
Ian Solomon. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. In response to the Honourable Member, the Secretary of State will still be required to maintain arrangements to review approved technical education qualification standards and assessment plans with a view to determining whether they should be revised or withdrawn and whether qualifications should continue to be approved. The current approach to review is rigid and burdensome given the volume of standards. Now, over 700 high-quality occupational standards are now available since IFE was first established since it was first introduced in 2014, and IFE was first established in 2017.
Could you give way on that point? The Minister is saying that this is an excessively onerous requirement. Could you give us some sense of the volume that is required, the volume of work that is required as a result of this current phrase and clause? What does onerous mean? Who is having to do what? How many people are having to devote how many man hours to doing what? How many people are employed purely to do what? What is the evidence that this is, quote, onerous?
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christian. If the Honourable Member would just allow me to continue a bit further, then I will actually explain. So, as I'd said, the current approach to review is too rigid, burdensome, given the volume of standards, assessment plans and technical education qualification, and it fails to recognise the difference in starts, achievement rates, rapid changes in skills needs, and, for example, as I've already mentioned, digital. Originally, it was expected that reviews should be carried out every 3 years, but with the proliferation of standards assessment plans and technical education, qualifications to review. Sorry, I'll just say that one more time. Originally, it was expected that reviews should be carried out every 3 years, but with the proliferation of standards, assessment plans and technical education qualifications to review, IFE was unable to maintain this cycle. And therefore, as I have outlined, this clause will I've outlined, this clause will not remove the requirement for the Secretary of State to conduct reviews. It will, however, allow the Secretary of State to be more targeted by prioritising reviews that are most needed rather than working to set intervals. I urge the committee to support clause 6.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. So the government's argument is that the requirement to just review, you don't have to rewrite, but to review qualifications every 3 years is excessive. And I just wonder whether that is really excessive in the eyes of most of the users and the employers involved in these schemes. We've seen elsewhere a sort of bureaucratic collapse with the OFS, for example, halting the accreditation of new higher education institutions. That is not a good thing. That is a problem that needs to be fixed rather than an excuse to get rid of that requirement. And I think it's the same with this clause here. I do think that the government are making a mistake on this, but we're not going to vote against clause stand part.
The question is that clause 6 stand part of the bill. Does many people say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clause 7 stand part of the bill, and with this it's going to be convenient to discuss clause 8 stand part. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I rise to speak to Group 4, which relates to clauses 7 and 8 of the bill. Clause 7 amends the 2009 Act to substitute a requirement for independent third-party examination of all new standards and assessment plans to discretionary power for the Secretary of State to make arrangements to do so. The default position will remain that the Secretary of State will make arrangements for independent third-party examination of new standards and assessment plans prior to their approval. The clause will provide an alternative approach in certain circumstances where obtaining third-party examination is duplicative or not necessary. We envisage there are scenarios where the Secretary of State is not likely to make arrangements for an examination. For example, it's highly regulated occupations in the health sector, where the regulatory requirements for occupational competence must be reflected in the occupational standard and assessment plan. Third-party review would be duplicative and an inefficient use of resources. Similarly, where a regulator is directly supporting development of the occupational standard and apprenticeship assessment plan and can assure themselves that they will meet regulatory requirements, an independent third-party examination will also become redundant. The option is not to arrange an independent third-party review, but may also be deployed where employers place high value in a professional body's mandated qualification for key skills and behaviour learning outcomes, and the occupational standard adopts this very closely, such as a CIPD and the HR standard. In such cases, an external review would be nugatory. This is also the case for emerging or highly specialised occupations, such as in the nuclear industry, where the group or persons preparing the industry represent the totality of interested parties. Without this clause, third-party examinations of all new standards and assessment plans would continue to be required in every instance, with no benefit to the content but drains on time and resource to deliver. Moving to clause 8, which enables Ofqual to determine whether or not there should be an accreditation requirement in relation to approved technical education qualifications or technical education qualifications that the Secretary of State is considering approving. When the Secretary of State has been notified that it may do so. At present, Ofqual is prevented from making determinations on accreditation for technical qualifications. This means that in respect of accreditation, technical qualifications are treated differently from academic qualifications. This clause will change that and provide greater parity in the future by enabling the Secretary of State to, if so desirable, create a route to accrediting technical qualifications. The clause provides the Secretary of State with the discretion to determine, should it be deemed appropriate, that an exception could be granted to Ofqual being prevented from accrediting approval technical education qualifications. From accrediting approved technical education qualifications. This would also apply in respect of technical education qualifications that the Secretary of State is considering approving. This will mean that Ofqual could exercise its power to determine whether an accreditation requirement should apply to technical education qualifications subject to appropriate consultation. The Secretary of State could use this power, for example, where they determined there needs to be a consistent tool to secure quality across academic and technical qualifications where they are taken by the same cohort of students. Without this clause, Ofqual would be unable to accredit technical education qualifications which are approved or pending approval, even where the Secretary of State and Ofqual took the view it would be advantageous for the skills system and for employers and learners. I commend clause 7 and 8 to the committee and ask they stand as part of the bill.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I want to imagine a hypothetical scenario where you have a hypothetical future government unrelated to this one. And let's say this hypothetical future government has passed a budget which is a bit of a turkey and it's not done good things to the economy. And this hypothetical government is taking a bit of money out of apprenticeships to spend on other things. It's giving this government a bit of a problem. And this hypothetical future government might, because it's unlike the current one, doesn't have good intentions, it might be tempted to try and prop up apprenticeship numbers and numbers on other technical qualifications by debasing standards. And that would be a problem for that hypothetical future government to have these independent examinations, which Clause 7 is getting rid of because independent third parties would object to the debasement of standards. I won't labour the point, Sir Christopher. Clause 7 would amend a section of the 2009 Act to remove the requirement for independent third parties to examine occupational standards or apprenticeship assessment plans before approval. Once again, the Secretary of State, there she goes again, would have the power to make such arrangement. And the policy document explains that this clause would mean that the position on third-party examinations would change from being obligatory to being optional. So Clause 7 would make it possible for no third-party examination of a standard or an apprenticeship assessment plan to be undertaken at all. So once again, DFE maximalism and a move away from a super rigorous employer-led system. We want the technical education system to be like the Deutschmark rather than the Weimar currency, right? We want it to be like the gold coin that you can bite down on. We want to be everyone to know that it's really good. And all these things, which might seem inconsequential or annoying to DFE officials, are there for a reason. This is why there is independent assessment. And once again, it's being got rid of. Now, I'll turn on to Clause 8, which was a subject of great confusion, but an endless inquiry in the other place, with lots of very, very knowledgeable and learned peers trying to understand what the government's intent was, what was going on, what the point of it was. And I've read it all several times. I'm not sure we ever really got to the bottom of it. Perhaps the Minister today will help us to get to the bottom of some questions about this. So what Clause 8 does is it amends the 2009 Act to specify that when the Secretary of State deems it appropriate, again discretion, Ofqual would have the power, as to the discretion, to exercise its accreditation power for technical education qualifications. And in the other place, the Minister gave the example that, and I quote, "The Secretary of State may deem it appropriate to ask Ofqual to consider whether imposing an accreditation requirement on the qualifications in question could help maintain their quality and signal to the wider system that they are broadly commensurate with other accredited qualifications in terms of rigour. For example, the Secretary of State could use this power in instances where it's important to ensure that students who opt into and successfully complete high-quality technical education qualifications are in no way disadvantaged as compared to their peers who pursue academic qualifications." And this raises just a lot of different questions. At present, we have a guarantee of quality through a legally independent institute with a very high level of employer ownership. If we are worried that under this new system, users will then, on top of that, require additional reassurance, that does rather beg the question of why we are making this change. And more practically, I wonder if I could ask the Minister, if some but not all technical qualifications are going to be accredited by Ofqual and so have that particular status, what impact will that have on perceptions of all the others that do not have that status? And secondly, the Skills Minister in the Lords talks about it being needed to show that high-quality technical education qualifications are equivalent to academic ones. Well, okay, so there's now going to be this third category of ones that are the technical qualifications, that these are the really good ones that are Ofqual accredited, and then the other ones are what? What are they? And it seems to me, though they don't say this, that the qualification that ministers have in mind is probably T-levels. And I just don't know quite why they're not spitting that out. Anyway, Piers did not, I'm afraid, get to the bottom of this question. I hope perhaps we can get to the bottom of it today. What type of qualifications is it that ministers are really thinking of using this? Why would we suddenly need this now once we move from IFATE to Skills England in a way that we didn't before? And won't we end up creating two tiers of technical qualifications where some are Ofqual approved and others are not? Won't there be a perverse consequence from that?
Ian Solomon. Damien Hines.
Thank you very much, Sir Christopher. So, clauses 7 and 8 are grouped, and I'm sure there is a reason for that, but it strikes me they are quite different. I want to say a word about both, if I may. First of all, in clause 7, because this is about independent third parties examination, and I think that gives an opportunity to talk also about the overall principle of having independent evaluation of standards and making sure that they are up to scratch. And I'm conscious that the Honourable Lady who represents Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes asked a question earlier, and we didn't have the documentation to hand at the time. I didn't want to leave it hanging in the air. She was asking, I think, specifically whether the words that my Honourable friend, the Shadow Minister, had used were the exact phrase, represent the exact phrase from the 2015 Ofsted report reporting on the then apprenticeships regime. So, helpfully, Mr. Christopher, I hope, I have the precise words here. Inspectors found that in a third of the 45 providers visited, apprenticeships did not provide sufficient high-quality training that stretched the apprentices and improved their capabilities. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a couple of sentences. Inspectors observed, for example, apprentices in the food production, retail and care sectors who were simply completing their apprenticeship by having existing low-level skills such as making coffee, serving sandwiches or cleaning floors accredited. While these activities are no doubt important to the everyday running of the businesses, as apprenticeships, they do not add enough long-term value to the individual companies or tackle skill shortages effectively. Key sentence. Some learners on low-level, low-quality programmes were unaware that they were even on an apprenticeship. As suggested by some learners during the survey, a question needs to be asked. Are these apprenticeships worthy of the name? So I mentioned that, well, for two reasons. Firstly, because it came up, it was a question. And secondly, because I think it is very important that we pay close attention, not only to this position at any one moment in time, but to make sure that we create a system which is in a sense self-regulating, that doesn't allow for standards to be eroded. And independence of the body setting the standards, independent third-party checking of the standards, along with the leading employers who will benefit from employing these people, I think is the surest way of doing that. Now, in Clause 7, on this question about independent third parties examining occupational standards or apprenticeship assessment, I mean, this is a repeat, in a sense, of a debate we had on one of the earlier clauses. And I think the arguments, the probing arguments, if you like, the challenges from us are the same as they were in that case. So the government says that third-party examination isn't necessary in some sectors because, for example, in highly regulated occupations, the standard required is obvious, or as the Minister said in the other place, an external review would be nugatory. But isn't there still some value in independent verification of that? And if there is going to be verification, aren't the people best placed to do it those who are in the sector? Now, turning to Clause 8, I've got to be honest, Sir Christopher, and in this place it's difficult because one doesn't want to sort of reveal that you don't know something. I am nonplussed by this clause. I'd just be honest and say I really don't know what's going on. It's about Ofqual and about why and in what circumstances Ofqual may accredit a technical qualification if the Secretary of State says it's all right for them to do so. And my honourable friend said it seemed most likely that the government had in mind T-levels, and can't they just spit that out? Well, that's one possibility. My worry actually is the opposite worry. So, or not worry, let's just call it a question. Let's make it a neutral term. So, Ofqual does have a role in regulating T-levels. I was just reading the page from Ofqual that says, actually I can't open it up, that says how we are regulating the technical qualification element of T-levels. So, when the government now says, well, they can do it if the Secretary of State says it's okay, does that mean they might stop doing that? Or does it mean they're going to do the same thing for the same approach there for T-levels they're now going to do for some other qualifications? That's not necessarily invalid, but it would be a move away from the vision of the noble Lord Sainsbury, who wanted to have a streamlining, a simplification, and a broader understanding of the qualifications in technical and vocational. So there would be the apprenticeship route, and there would be a college-based route, and for most, not all, because there will always be some particularly specialist qualifications. There will always be, of course, students with special needs, and for whatever other reason, but for the majority of cases, the college-based route, and these 15 routes, would be the T-level. So I wonder if, buried in the, I mean, I have to say slightly, I'm not saying it's obfuscated, I'm sure it's not on purpose, Sir Christopher, but for mortals like myself, quite difficult to penetrate text here. I wonder if there's something that this committee really needs to understand, which right now I do not.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I would just like to emphasise, Sir Christopher, that no one is seeking to erode the standards. We're seeking to improve the skills system. We recognise the need to move things on to quicken up the process, and this government is entirely committed to doing that. We recognise the skills gap. We recognise the need to ensure that people have the skills they need to get into the employment that they need. This is a government that has a mission for growth and breaking down barriers for opportunities. And in Clause 7 and indeed in Clause 8, we are seeking to move along the processes to make sure our system is more flexible and agile and can respond to the present markets and businesses and employers. In Clause 8, which in terms of off-call, we are not trying to create a two-tier system.
What are we trying to do?
The bill removes what is currently an unnecessary and blanket ban on the accreditation of technical education qualifications. There are of course then options for using the new flexibilities in accreditation, which will need to be considered in the interest of employers and learners. The Secretary of State will carefully consider when it may be appropriate for off-call to accredit technical qualifications. And with regards to clause 7, in certain circumstances, obtaining independent third-party examinations of new standards and assessment plans is not necessary or is duplicative, wasting time and resources, and we need to move things on.
I'm very grateful to for giving way. So unless someone has hacked gov.uk, can she explain how, in the blanket ban on off-qual regulating technical qualifications, there is a page on gov.uk entitled Information on how off-qual is regulating the technical qualification component of T-levels?
I thank the honourable member for raising that, but in relation to what this bill is doing in clause 8, we want to make sure that off-qual is able to accredit technical qualifications where the Secretary of State deems this appropriate. And on that basis, I would like to thank members for their contributions, and I would like clauses 7 and 8 are essential in ensuring that skills people have the flexibility to respond nimbly to an evolving skills system. I therefore urge the Committee to support clauses 7 and 8.
Christopher, one of the things we have not heard so far in the debate on clause 7 is any example of a long delay being caused by the requirement for an independent assessment. I thought the Minister would give us some examples of, such and such a qualification was delayed in coming in for a year because of the requirement to get an independent view of it. And such an, qualification X, came out 18 months later than it should have done because of the requirement to have an independent examination of whether it's legit or not. If the Minister has any examples like that, I'm absolutely happy to take an intervention or to hear from her what the examples are of why this is a problem. This is quite a big safeguard to take off, to have the independent bodies. It is the same safeguard that we absolutely have with double belt and braces on the academic side, but for some reason that is not needed for the technical side, because, I don't know, as ever, it's not going to go to the ball. But look, if the Minister has any examples of the big delays that this is causing and why it's so awful that she must be able to be nimble and swashbuckling and be able to just bang all these things through, I'd love to hear them, but so far, neither in the Lords, in the other place or here have we heard those examples, and for that reason I am keen to vote against stand part for clause 7.
The question is that clause 7 stand part of the bill. Many people say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Division. Lock the doors.
Pam Cox.
Aye.
Janet Davey.
Aye.
Josh Dean.
Aye.
Lauren Edwards. Vicky Foxcroft.
Aye.
Anna Gelderd.
Aye.
Damien Hines. Lee Ingham.
Aye.
Neil O'Brien.
No.
Melanie Ong.
Aye.
Rebecca Paul.
No.
Ian Solomon. Alan Strickland.
Aye.
Peter Swallow.
Aye.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you. Ayes 11, noes 3, so the ayes have it. Unlock. The question is that clause 8 stand part of the bills. Many people say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to amendment number 7. Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Government is completely reversing the direction of apprenticeships policy. Where we lengthened apprenticeships, they have cut the length of an apprenticeship to 8 months. By abolishing IFET and bringing it in-house at DFE, they're eroding independence and employer ownership. And where we grew higher apprenticeships, they are planning to abolish many or maybe even most Level 7 apprenticeships, carefully built up over recent years. So our Amendment 7 requires a report on those Level 7 apprenticeships. For decades and decades, politicians have stood up and said they want to make apprenticeships and technical education more generally more prestigious, parity of esteem. We've heard this speech a million times. Now, the last government did do things to push in that direction. We've already talked about the move from frameworks to much more rigorous standards with independent examination at the end. That was part of it. And the other part of it was the growth in the number of higher apprenticeships. And the number of people on higher apprenticeships went up from just over 3,000 in 2010 to 273,000 last year. A huge increase. But now we've already mentioned the things that the government are doing which are not good for apprenticeship numbers, both the budget, the 25 billion increase in national insurance, and also the potential move, however big it is or is not, of either 50 or some other number % of apprenticeship levy funds out into other things. Perfectly legitimate to argue that that is desirable, but certainly not going to be good for apprenticeship numbers once we find out what that number is. Now, to address the gap ministers are creating with the budget and with their decisions on moving money out of the levy from apprenticeships to other things. Well, the government are doing two things. They're doing partly the shorter apprenticeships, which is my right honourable friend from East Hampshire pointed out, is an echo of the old traineeships that didn't work out so well. But they're also trying to redistribute the money out of Level 7 apprenticeships into other things, and they've repeatedly refused to rule out doing the same thing in future to Level 6 apprenticeships too. Now, the Level 7 apprenticeships that the government is currently planning to axe currently account for about 9% of apprenticeship spending and about 7% of all starts. So they're not a huge part of the system, but they're a big part, and a lot of good things will potentially be lost by abolishing them. Over the last 7 years, almost 123,000 people have started a Level 7 apprenticeship. This is a postgraduate level apprenticeship, with 24,000 people starting one in the last full year of our government, so it's been ramping up quickly. And 48% of Level 7 apprentices who answered the Department of Education's own apprenticeship evaluation in 2023, they were first-generation students. Their parents had not been to university. Like me, they were first time, in that case, not of going to university, but of getting university-level postgraduate qualifications via the apprenticeship route. We finally actually did make them a highly prestigious route. We really did treat them the same way as university degrees. You could go all the way to the top of the ladder using the apprenticeship side rather than the go to university side. And yet, initially, the government were talking about axing pretty much all of them. The rhetoric seems to have been slightly tempered. I hope we could temper it further. But we are still looking at axing some really, really prestigious things, hence our amendment. Now, restricting Level 7 apprenticeships will disproportionately impact on public services. For example, nearly half of all chartered management apprentices, who are nearly all Level 7, they work in the public sector. And Dan Lally, who's the head of skills and employability at Sheffield Hallam University, said that the Level 7 restrictions will, and I quote, disproportionately impact on public services. We are meeting vital skills gaps in disciplines such as advanced clinical practitioners. These are NHS workers, civil servants and local authority employees. A high number of our Level 7 apprentices come from the areas of highest deprivation. And for example, to give a specific example within the public services, Level 7 apprentices are absolutely central to the NHS's own long-term workforce plan. Last year, we saw the government's very disappointing decision to cancel the Level 7 doctors' apprenticeships. This means, apart from the fact that we have taken out a route to the very top professions for a group of people who might otherwise not be able to access them, this means that there'll be a shortfall of around 2,000 medical places a year by 2031. The long-term workforce plan set out the need for 15,000 medical school places by 2031, of which 30% were going to be through apprenticeships. But the students who already started on the medical doctor apprenticeship have now been left in limbo. So that's the government's statement of an intent they've already done in the Level 7 doctor's apprenticeship. And I am now concerned that as part of this review that is about to be published any day now, that the government is going to do something similar to nurses. Again, the NHS workforce plan proposes to increase the total number of nurses by 170,000 so that it reaches 550,000 by 2036. And the plan set the ambition that 28% of nurses would come through the apprenticeship route, so about 50,000 of that 170,000. And within that, about a quarter, 23%, of NHS nursing roles are at Agenda for Change Band 7 or higher, which typically require a master's level degree or equivalent. So you'd expect about 11,000 of those nurses, those extra nurses, to be coming via the Level 7 apprenticeships. Now, if we get rid of those, that is a big hole in the NHS's workforce plans. And these are all specialist nursing qualifications that we need, like school nursing, health visiting, advanced clinical practice, community nursing, and so on. And as well as the NHS, local government also makes very substantial use of Level 7 apprentices, including the extra town planners that the government says are needed to deliver on its housing targets. Deborah Johnson, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at London South Bank University, says, over half of the employers that we work with on Level 7 apprenticeships are local authorities. Our apprentices enable councils to deliver projects in the wake of increased demand and reintroduced mandatory housing targets. The suggestion that, as employers, local authorities should step in and pay for the Level 7 apprenticeships themselves is fanciful. And the professions, outside the public sector, the professions are also worried. The Institute of Chartered Accountants has said that axing Level 7 apprenticeships will lead to work leaving the UK altogether. They say that, and I quote, removing Level 7 apprenticeship funding will mean that fewer UK training roles are created. Instead, organisations are likely to turn to offshoring to replace UK training roles. And the Chartered Management Institute have said of their profession, cutting funding for Level 7 apprenticeships would risk creating gaps in leadership and technical expertise at a time when businesses in the public sector need them most. And I've actually been contacted directly by firms who are worried about the abolition of the solicitor's apprenticeship, which is a really great way into the law for people, particularly from those from less privileged backgrounds, but more generally for people who don't want to run up a large amount of debt by going to university and instead want to earn and learn. And one firm who are really worried about this, Bolt, Bird and Kemp, told me this will really impact on social mobility into sectors like law, accountancy and consulting. The traditional route into law is expensive, and therefore, without the apprenticeship scheme, many would not be able to afford to do so. We also believe it would have a detrimental impact on the reputation of apprenticeships. I think that's right. By putting what might seem like just the top of the pyramid on the system, you add to the prestige of the whole system. British Airways used to talk about the halo effect from having Concorde. It changed their whole brand. It changed the way they were seen more generally. And these Level 7 apprenticeships, as well as just being very, very useful and very, very remunerative in their own right, also changed the way apprenticeships are seen in the way that all politicians have claimed for decades on end that they want to see happen. Similarly, Atwell's solicitors say that reducing funding to Level 7 apprentices runs the risk of removing opportunities into professions where a qualification equivalent to a master's is mandatory. And they note that reducing funding for Level 7 apprentices will likely impact diversity and social mobility in professional careers such as law. Apprenticeships help break down barriers not only into law but all career paths, which could be inaccessible to young people without them. Indeed, many of the things that we currently have Level 7 apprentices in are things that we are short of nationally, and that is why the Campaign for Learning have called for skills immigration worker test before defunding Level 7 apprenticeships, so that we don't simply go from investing in British workers into importing workers from other countries to fill the whole, exactly the same point that was being made about the chartered accountants as well, that if you don't invest in people here, the work leaves or you have to bring people in from elsewhere. So I think it's pretty clear from my remarks, Sir Christopher, that we think that culling Level 7 in order to fill a gap that the government are creating through its other policies is a big mistake. Not only are they vital across the public sector, they're also a vital way into the professions for people who will otherwise struggle to enter. And they're the real capstone of the drive to make apprenticeships truly prestigious and a ladder that you can use to get all the way to the top. And if I can be self-critical for a while, we had a target for some time of 300,000 apprenticeships. And I could see within government how that created pressure to debate standards to hit the number. Happens all the time. In communist China, you would set a target to produce more nails and they would produce billions of tiny useless nails. Then you would set a target to produce a greater weight of nails and produce people who produce a few massive nails, which would also be useless. Targetology is always dangerous, and if you don't have the right institutions and the right independence, the short-termism of politicians can become a dangerous thing. And with the level 7 apprenticeships, it's particularly frustrating because they have taken a lot of time and effort to set up. A lot of hard labour has gone into them. Some of them have been real labours of love, particularly from professions where they themselves think, you know, we don't want us all to be from a very privileged background. We want someone to grow up on a counter estate and be able to still be a solicitor or be whatever they want to be. And so we've gone through this grind of years of standard setting and years of trying to mobilise the sector to do it. And we've got some people's hopes up, and we've got even people onto the doctors' apprenticeships, and then kibosh them. So I just think it would be tragic if the government do what they have said they are going to do. We would be shooting ourselves in the foot, and this amendment really, to be honest with you, only just gives us some good evidence of the consequences of doing so.
Amendment proposed, clause 9, page 4, line 13. At the end, insert the words on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Ian Solomon? Damien Hymes.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Before I talk about clause 9 and amendment 7, if it's not out of order, may I just ask a question related to the previous clause, not to try and relitigate the argument, but just to ask, and I don't know what is the correct process, if it's to ask the Minister to write to me or to the committee or to what it is, but I feel, I'm afraid, that I still don't understand what the government's intent is with clause 8, and I hope it will be possible to do that. Turning to... Forgive me.
Obviously, he can do that, but we're just debating Amendment 7. We're going to debate clause 9 stand part separately.
Oh, forgive me on that front as well. In which case, I only have 2 questions specifically on the amendment, which are, and my honourable friend rightly asked about public sector workforce, specifically for the DfE. What impact do they expect for the postgraduate teaching apprenticeship and for persuading graduate TAs to become teachers?
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Amendment 7 would require the Secretaries of State report about the exercise of functions transferred from IFA to include information on the impact on the provision of level 7 apprenticeships in England. This amendment would duplicate the duty in this bill for the Secretary of State to report on the impact of the exercise of relevant functions on apprenticeships. What the amendment appears to be asking for is already in scope of the report as described in clause 9 of the bill. I can also reassure members that Skills England's analysis and insight, which highlights skills needs in our economy, will reflect how far apprenticeships and other technical qualifications are meeting those needs on an ongoing basis. I should be clear that Skills England will be an evidence-based, authoritative voice on skills, with a broad and ambitious remit to identify and tackle skills gaps. While it will have a significant impact across the government and indeed the country, it is part of a skills system where priority skills policy, strategy and funding decisions remain for the Secretary of State and for Cabinet. Taking advice from Skills England, we'll be asking more employers to step forward and fund level 7 apprenticeships, and as I've already said, we'll be setting out more information shortly. I therefore ask the Honourable Member that he withdraws his amendment.
It seems like a strange argument to me, Sir Christopher, to say in response to a clause that is requiring the production of more evidence that it's all fine because the Skills England will be so evidence-led. That is the entire point of our amendment here. I don't think the government does want to talk about what it's planning to do on level 7 apprenticeships, and nor did we hear any defence of it or any attempt to describe what will or will not be done as part of this review from the Minister. And I think sometimes the silences in these discussions are as telling as everything else. Quite a few of the organisations that are warning about the axing of level 7 apprenticeships are also making the point, which I think is true, that it won't do what ministers hope it will do. So ministers hope, I think, that it will move the resource to level 2 and 3 apprenticeships. And it's a perfectly good argument for trying to do more at those levels. That's why we brought in the 100% funding for SMEs, for example. You could go much further on that. But as numerous organisations and academics have pointed out, actually, if you kibosh level 7, probably the first place that the money will go to is level 6. And that is why we keep asking, but without ever getting an answer, ministers to rule out doing what they are planning to do to level 7, to level 6 as well, because that's where actually the real money is. That's about 36%, I think, of all the funding compared to the 9%. Something like that. I might be wrong about 36, but it's roughly that. And if you actually want to prop up the system and offset some of the other things the government are doing, you probably will go after level 6 apprenticeships. But we never hear, whenever we ask this in the chamber elsewhere, we say, will ministers rule out kiboshing level 6 apprenticeships and whether they are doing with level 7? We never get an intervention, we never get an answer, and I invite again the Minister today to rule out axing level 6 apprenticeships in the way that they are doing with level 7. But no, I am very keen that we do put this to the vote. It's not good enough to say we are so evidence-led, but then to be doing something which is hasty, secret, is being advised against by many experts in the sector. Delighted. I hope as she rises to her feet, I hope we'll get an answer on this point about level 6. Is the Minister going to rule out kiboshing level 6 in the way that she is doing with level 7?
Minister.
I just thought I'd help the Honourable Member with his questions and respond. Level 6 apprenticeships are indeed a core part of our apprenticeships offer, supporting growth and opportunity. We're reforming the apprenticeship levy into a growth and skills offer to deliver greater flexibility for learners and indeed employers. Decisions on training, funding through the levy in the future will be guided, of course, by Skills England.
Well, thank you. I think that was a very clear not ruling out of doing exactly what they're doing to level 7 apprenticeships to level 6 there. Not quite phrased in that way, but clearly ministers are keeping their options open. And given that ministers are clearly looking to keep their options open, not just on level 7, but on level 6 as well, which is very, very concerning. And a real backward step and a real kind of wrecking ball to a lot of the progress that has been made on apprenticeships over the last decade or more on a cross-party basis. I am absolutely even more keen that we do at least have this report on the impact of what they're doing to level 7. So I am keen to move to a vote on this amendment.
Amendment proposed, clause 9, page 4, line 13, at end, insert the words on the amendment paper. The question is, the amendment been made? Has many been say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no?
No.
Division. What the rules?
Pam Cox.
No.
Janet Davey.
No.
Josh Dean.
No.
Lauren Edwards. Vicky Foxcroft.
No.
Anna Gelderd.
No.
Damien Hines.
Aye.
Lee Ingham.
No.
Neil O'Brien.
Aye.
Melanie On.
No.
Rebecca Paul.
Aye.
Ian Sollum.
Aye.
Alan Strickland.
No.
Peter Swallow.
No.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you. Ayes 4, noes 11, so the noes have it. Unlock. The question is that clause 9 stand part of the bill. Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. I rise to speak to clause 9. Clause 9 contains a duty for the Secretary of State to publish and lay before Parliament within 6 months after the closure of IFATE a report setting out which functions of this bill are being exercised by Skills England and the impact of the exercise of the functions transferred from IFATE to the Secretary of State in the bill on apprenticeships and technical education in England. As I indicated at the second reading, it's anticipated that the functions being transferred from IFATE to the Secretary of State related to the development, approval, review and revision of apprenticeships and technical education qualifications will largely be exercised by Skills England operating as an executive agency. It is after having listened to and acted on the contribution made by peers in the other place and their voices calling for greater transparency, the government has introduced this duty on the face of the bill. We have noted the broad support for Skills England throughout the passage of this bill and recognise that there is considerable interest in understanding exactly what it will do once it is fully formed. This reporting requirement is in addition to a broader set of expectations placed on all executive agencies that Skills England will be required to meet to provide transparency about its work and accountability for its performance. The reporting arrangements of executive agencies are clearly defined. They must produce an annual corporate plan and an annual report, both of which will be published in respect of Skills England, subject to any commercial considerations in the corporation plans. Guidance dictates that corporations' plans should include matters such as key objectives and performance targets, and assessments of current and recent performance against those targets. Furthermore, government's arrangements for Skills England will be set out in a framework document, a core constitutional document, which must be produced in line with guidance from HM Treasury. Skills England's framework document will be agreed between its board and ministers. Once finalised, it will be published online, and ministers will also deposit a copy in both houses. However, without this clause, there will not be a requirement set out on the face of legislation for the Secretary of State to transparently report on exactly what functions in the bill Skills England is taken on. I therefore commend Clause 9 to the committee.
Yeah, Brown.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. The Clause 9 is here because of the level of disquiet about this bill in the House of Lords, and the fact that there was literally not even a mention of Skills England in the bill when it was introduced. And we'll be returning to this issue when we get to new clauses 1 from Liberal Democrats, and our new clauses 2 and 3 as well, of actually trying to put Skills England onto a statutory footing, or to at least put more of a clear legislative framework around it than we have at the moment. All we have at the moment is this report, and we're not going to vote against it standing part because it's better than absolutely nothing, but it's pretty thin. All the moment we have is this report and the framework, which again is very, very thin. And to be honest with you, it is less me that should worry about that and more ministers, because I just don't get from it any great clarity on what they are hoping that Skills England will do, or how it will operate in such a way that there is some degree of protection, not just for employers, but sometimes it can also be protection for ministers, some degree of insulation from these choices, so that it doesn't become entirely politicised. But we haven't yet got that. Look, I hope that this report will be a positive thing, and the making of it will be an encouragement to the government to clarify their own thinking on what they are really trying to achieve here, and they're thinking about how these new institutions within the DfE are going to work. But we will, because we're going to be coming back to this at new clause 1, 2 and 3. I'll rest my remarks here, other than really to ask the Minister if she wants to do this, to get a sense from her of what she really sees as the big opportunity. So it's very easy to say for ministers, we're going to bring everything together and all be in one place and have a great coherent view over the whole system. Great, right. Hard to object to in principle, or good. What is the thing that they are minded to do as a result of that? Is there something that they are thinking is a big opportunity? Is it some new category of qualification? Is it some overlapping of qualification? What is the you say you want to look at everything together, which of course the DfE already does, right? There's a department that can give you an overarching view, and there's the centre of government that can bring together the views of all of the different departments. But what is it that ministers really hope from Skills England? In a sense that they can say, we'll give you a report in however many months' time, 6 months' time, this will come out. But I'm just interested in hearing from the Minister, what does she see as the big opportunity that will come from this, other than it will be more joined up, we'll look at everything together at high level? Is there a specific thing that ministers are hoping to do off the back of that machinery of government? Because it's a big thing. Their own impact assessment says that it will lead to delays and a fall in starts. You can say that's acceptable because there is some big prize at the end of the road. What is the big prize? And I won't repeat all the quotes I've already read out from Labour ministers, former Labour ministers and Labour peers in the other place, worrying about what one of them called the lack of the second half of this bill, the lack of the bit where we get to the setting up of Skills England, and in particular Lord Blunkett's says that this is not quite what he expected, that he thought we would be having what was promised in the King's speech, a Skills England bill that set up the new independent Skills England as a proper arm's length body. I won't rehash all those things here, but I do encourage the Minister to give us a sense of what she thinks the big opportunity is going to be and what she will do as a result of the creation of Skills England.
Ian Solomon. Damien Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Christian. My apologies for my misreading of the groupings earlier. So this clause 9, is the new clause inserted by the government in response to the other place, for there to be a report on the exercise of the Secretary of State functions. And the report to be made within 6 months and laid before Parliament. And it will cover which functions are going to be done through Skills England, and it will talk about the impact of the exercise of the relevant functions on apprenticeships and technical education. Now, new clause 2, when we get there, we're not there today, when we get there, we'll propose that all the functions of IF8 go to Skills England. And I suppose the obvious question is, well, why not? Why wouldn't they? And perhaps when we come to new clause 2 debates, there'll be an opportunity for the government to tell us. But my question for now is, we've heard a bunch of times about how there's been all this preparatory work and it's been a long time in the making, and Skills England exists in shadow form, and they've thought about it a great deal. So why can't they tell us now which functions are going to go to Skills England? And on the second thing, about the impact of the exercise of the relevant functions, is it really right for the body itself to talk about what its impact has been, or shouldn't there be some external validation of that to consider the effectiveness of the body? My 3 questions for now to the Minister are these. First of all, we know it will be laid before Parliament. What will the status of that document be? Will Parliament be able to debate it? Will it be binding in some way? And what if this Secretary of State or any future Secretary of State takes a different view? And bear in mind that through this legislation they would be allowed to. If they take a different view, will a new report be required, and will Parliament have any say in that?
Minister.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. Clause 9 is about improving the reporting and transparency of Skills England, and shows that this government's willingness to listen, to work constructively with members here and indeed in the other place. And I believe I've already outlined what Skills England will do, but for the sake of clarity, Skills England will for the first time mean that there is a single organisation responsible for identifying skill needs in our economy, designing training which reflects employers' skills needs, and working in all parts of the country so that training available reflects national and regional priorities. Might I also add, we have a skills shortage. Shortage in our country. We also have a workforce shortage, and we need more people trained up to take on the very jobs that are needed in our society. We want to get things moving, and this is why we are bringing this bill before this committee. Might I also add that in relation to accountability, the Secretary of State will be accountable as usual before Parliament and also before relevant select committees as well as Skills England. And on that point, I urge the committee to support Clause 9.
The question is, Clause 9, Stamp Party Bills. Many can say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Amendment 8, which would be convenient to discuss Amendment 9 and Clause 10, Stamp Party. Ian Solomon.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. So I rise to move and speak to Amendments 8 and 9, which address really a fundamental concern that we have with this bill, and that's the lack of proper parliamentary scrutiny. So, as drafted, Clause 10 gives the Secretary of State sweeping powers to make consequential provisions through regulations. While statutory instruments containing regulations that amend primary legislation would require the affirmative procedure, all other regulations would be subject merely to the negative procedure. Amendments 8 and 9 together would ensure that for that critical first 6 months after this Act passes, the period when the most consequential regulations are likely to be introduced, all such regulations would require the approval of both houses of Parliament, regardless of whether they amend primary legislation. And this committee should be concerned about this because the bill already centralises considerable power in the hands of ministers, as we've discussed many times today. We know that the intention of the government is that Skills England is an executive agency of the Department for Education, but without the safeguards that these amendments provide, Parliament would have extremely limited oversight of how the transfer of the functions of IFA to Skills England is actually implemented. And this matters most during the transition period, which stakeholders, as well as the government's own analysis, have highlighted as fraught with risk. Now, we've been given little detail about the governance structures of Skills England, its degree of operational independence, or its accountability mechanisms. And given that uncertainty, ensuring robust parliamentary scrutiny of the regulations that will shape its operation is not unreasonable. The 6-month period suggested in the amendment strikes a sensible balance and doesn't permanently encumber the regulatory process, but it does ensure in those critical early decisions about how the functions will operate receive proper scrutiny from both houses. So this is about good governance. If the government is confident in its approach to Skills England, I would suggest that it should welcome scrutiny and not resist it. Just finish by saying the skills system really is important to our future. I think we all agree on that. And these are quite fundamental changes, and for those to be made without proper parliamentary oversight would be extremely disappointing. Thank you.
Amendment proposed, clause 10, page 4, line 32, at beginning insert, subject to subsection 6. The question is the amendment been made? Neil Brown.
Thank you, Christopher. This is an extremely sensible amendment, which we welcome. It strikes me, though I'm not a liberal, one of the great strengths of the liberal tradition is a suspicion, sort of knee-jerk suspicion of centralisation, and this bill is, of course, a form of centralisation in lots of different ways and takes lots of breaks off. And we keep hearing in these sessions that we must do this because we must move quickly, and we must get rid of this form of scrutiny because of the need to move quickly. And the honourable gentleman is quite right to be nervous about that, and then in this instance to be nervous about the lack of limits on the consequentials that can be done off the back of this bill. I think it's an entirely sensible measure, which I hope that the government will accept. So I am keen to support the honourable gentleman's amendment.
Minister.
I rise to speak to Group 7, which includes Clause 10 and Amendment 8 and 9. Clause 10 contains provision for the Secretary of State to address any consequential effects that this bill may have on any other legislation. The Department recognises and takes seriously the important role Parliament has in scrutinising consequential amendments. That is why it has made every effort possible to ensure Schedules 1 and 3 capture the existing legislation in scope for consequential amendments, and that existing legislation passing through Parliament this session takes account of the provisions of this bill. As well as existing primary legislation, Clause 10 will allow the Secretary of State to address any consequential effects this bill may have on other bills passing through Parliament this session.
Would you give way on that
However,
point? I have a very specific question about this. So, Skills England doesn't quite bring all of the skills sector together. There are other excellent bodies. For example, the Migration Advisory Committee, which has a big skills component, but also other bodies that are literally running levies, like the CITB and the EITB, which have not been merged into Skills England or abolished. And the government has rejected the recommendation from the Farmer Review to merge the CITB and the EITB. And so I just wanted to check with the Minister. My understanding is that it would be possible for the government to use Clause 10 to abolish the CITB and the EITB. I don't see any particular reason why they couldn't do that under Clause 10. But the Minister may want to get advice from this. I appreciate I'm putting you on the spot a little bit. But there's nothing to stop such large changes being made off the back of Clause 10, which is one reason why we are keen on this amendment because these Henry VIII types of things, you see them and you think, well, you can't quite imagine how they might be used. But one of the problems is you can't quite imagine how they might be used, and you never know what will be done under these things. So I wondered if the Minister could just check that my understanding is correct, that you could do quite big things like that off the back of clause 10 here, or if that's not the case, I'm delighted to hear it.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for his introduction. Skills England is already is in communication with the Migration Advisory Committee and others as well, and has a broad remit, as well as having a relationship with CITB. I do feel that we may be swaying outside of the purpose of this bill. So
no, this is absolutely
so I will continue, but I am quite happy to get some further information if he feels that he needs some. But in terms, just want to finish my point. In terms of the merger of the ITB and EITB, there are good reasons why that merger is not the position of the government. And if you will let me make some more progress, I'd be quite happy to do so. However, there we are. So as well as existing primary legislation, Clause 10 will allow the Secretary of State to address any consequential effects this bill may have on other bills passing through Parliament this session. However, it is always possible that further changes may be necessary. It is therefore prudent to provide a fail-safe should anything have been missed. Without it, there is a risk not just to the coherence of legislation, but to the functioning of the system for employers and indeed learners. Should such a circumstance arise, any amendments to primary legislation will be made through the affirmative procedure. The necessary consequential amendments to secondary legislation, which cannot be made on the face of the bill, will be made through the negative procedure as is customary. We have already identified amendments to secondary legislation that are needed. For example, repealing a provision in the Apprenticeships Regulation 2017, which empowers IFATE to charge fees in relation to evaluations and apprenticeships assessments. Turning now to Amendments 8 and 9, for which I thank the Honourable Member, which would require regulations making consequential provisions which are subject to the negative procedure by virtue of Clause 10(5), to instead be subject to the affirmative procedure for a period of 6 months. The limited and uncontroversial nature of the necessary changes means that the negative procedure balances sufficient parliamentary oversight while enabling changes to be made without unduly taking up parliamentary time or taking the coherence of the skills system for the learners and employers. As members of this House will be aware, affirmative procedure requires debate and approval in both Houses. This would mean consequential amendments to existing secondary legislation would take longer, which could delay the implementation of the bill and create incoherence across the statute books until those necessary changes are made. There is a strong precedent for delegated legislation under the negative procedure to be used to make consequential amendments to delegated legislation, and therefore this amendment is seeking affirmative resolution is not necessary. For the reasons I have given, I commend this clause to the committee and ask that it stands as part of the bill, and I ask the Honourable Member withdraws their amendment. Thank you.
Ian Sol.
I thank the Minister for her response. I'm afraid I'm not satisfied that that's sufficient, and I would like to push this to a vote.
Amendment Clause 10, page 4, line 32, at the beginning is subject to subsection 6. The question is, the amendment been met? Then you say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no.
No.
Division. Yours.
Pam Fox,
No.
Janet Davey,
No.
Josh Dean,
No.
Lauren Edwards,
No.
Vicky Foxcroft,
No.
Anna Gelderd,
No.
Damien Hines,
Aye.
Lee Ingham,
No.
Neil O'Brien,
Aye.
Melanie On,
No.
Rebecca Paul,
Aye.
Ian Sollum,
Aye.
Alan Strickland,
No.
Peter Swallow,
No.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you. Ayes 4, noes 11. So the noes have it. Unlock. Clause 10 formally?
Formally.
The question is that clause 10 be part of the bill. As many opinions say aye?
Aye.
Contrary no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come...
I beg to move that this committee do now adjourn.
The question is that this committee do now adjourn. As many opinions say aye?
Aye.
Contrary no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the committee will meet again on Tuesday.
Committee Room 12, sound. Committee Room 12, sound. Committee Room 12, sound. Committee Room 12, sound. Committee Room 12, sound.